Hi, I'm Ilan Lieberman. We're talking a bit more about fibromyalgia and what can cause it. So in previous videos, we've talked about acute pain, we've talked about chronic pain, we talked about how acute pain can move to chronic pain. We talked about some of the factors in terms of your sleep and your circadian rhythm that can disrupt things and make things worse. Now I'd like to talk a bit more about how some people develop fibromyalgia and some people don't. So let's go to the facts that we know. Fibromyalgia across the planet affects 0.5% of men, 0.5% of men, and 5% of women. Now, in the old days, and to people that aren't clued up, let us say, on fibromyalgia as a disease entity, the explanation of that is that men are more stoic and women are less stoic, and there's quite a lot of misogyny in this, in my opinion. I don't believe that to be the case. I believe that we've got an issue here that boils down to people's genetics and boils down to the hormone differences between men and women and the different ways that men and women interpret pain biologically and experience it. So when you're created, you have some DNA from your mum and some DNA from your dad, and they fuse to give you your DNA. And the DNA is the code. It's the computer code of the good Lord or of evolution that enables your body to build the proteins that build your body, that works your body. Now, when I was a medical student back in the day, we thought that that code could only be interpreted one way, and that your proteins were made always the same way, and your genetic code couldn't be altered in your own lifetime. And we didn't really appreciate that not all of your body comes from both your mum and your dad. So an important part of your body, your mitochondria, and we talked about mitochondria briefly in a previous video, your mitochondria are what we call matrilineal. They only come from your mum. So your genetics in your mitochondria are from your mum. And so obviously then that suggests to me that there's a reason there why, if fibromyalgia is more common in women and you're inheriting something, everyone's inheriting something only from their mum, if there's an interplay between that and something else within the female genetic profile, that may be a reason why women have the problem slightly more than men. Because obviously the boys also have their mum's mitochondria, so it needs to be a little bit more than that. But it is a clue, I think. So we now know that in our DNA, we have the worker bits of the DNA, as it were, that make the protein. And then another section of the DNA, the epigenetic section of the DNA, which can turn on or turn off or change the way the worker bits work. And they do that by adding on small little chemical tails to the DNA to change the way that the DNA works, to change the types of protein it produces. And there have been some really interesting studies in the last 50 years that have demonstrated that health outcomes and health experience can change between a few generations and within a generation. And the classic study for this was the Dutch famine study. So in 1947, half the population of Holland starved and half didn't. And there's been a long longitudinal, meaning through the generations, studies of the health outcomes of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren from their grandmas who got fed well in Holland or who starved. And obviously it's becoming complex as you go through the generations, because you may have both grandmas in the first generation who starved, or one starved, one didn't, etc., through the generations. But what we know is that if you've had a grandma who starved, your health outcome, even if you're a normal, healthy, to the naked eye, absolutely normal Dutch person, your health outcome is worse if you've had grandmas who starved than if you didn't. And that can only be explained in the second and third and fourth generations by epigenetic change, by changing the way that your body's making these proteins. And similarly, we know that if it can change in the generation subsequently, it can obviously change within your own lifetime. So we think that fibromyalgia may be triggered through an epigenetic change in someone who's epigenetically vulnerable. So you have a DNA that predisposes you to being a person who might develop fibromyalgia. So you start out with a risk. You then have a challenge. And we know these challenges can be major trauma. So physical trauma, you get hit by a car, you fall off a roof, you break a few bones. Or it can be an emotional, really bad disturbance, a huge stress, a terrible period of abuse, a huge psychological challenge, or a series of these things that wears people down. It causes an epigenetic change that changes the way that you make your proteins. It changes the way that you perceive your pain experience because your proteins have changed. And then you become an overprocessor. And if you go back to the way the brains work, your brain then becomes more likely to become that city view, the lights are all on, as opposed to the Welsh Valley view. And suddenly, all the signals coming in from your body, your joint position, your touch, your pressure, your squeezing. Obviously, someone with fibromyalgia, I squeeze their forearm. It's really uncomfortable for them, but it's not uncomfortable for me. And I've had major trauma. I broke my pelvis in a cycling accident, but I don't have fibromyalgia. I was lucky. I was obviously born without that predilection to developing overprocessing. So I don't have that pain problem, but some people do. And we think that's caused by a genetic vulnerability, an epigenetic change, a change in the way that you're making your proteins, and change in your way that your brain perceives things. So that's how I think some people develop fibromyalgia. I think that fibromyalgia has many different causes, but the same phenotype, the same way it looks to the outside world. So to the outside world, your fibromyalgia is aching everywhere. It's pain, it's fogginess of thought, is reduced exercise tolerance, all of the things that you're experiencing. That's the picture you present to the outside world. How that's been caused in you as an individual, I think has multiple causes. But I think a big part of that is your epigenetic change.